Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. Hildy will also be posting an online lecture on leadership, but I'm going to focus on interprofessional education for interprofessional practice. So let's start with a little bit of the background. What we know is that evidence tells us that interprofessional practice is essential to improving healthcare system performance, and we've talked about that in class already. We don't need to keep making the case for interprofessional practice. The evidence speaks for itself, and really that's the last 30 years of grounded evidence and the last 100 years of anecdotal evidence. If you remember, we talked about going through World War I and World War II, and as they began to accumulate this understanding of how practice was changed. And then, remember, in that lecture through the 60s and 70s, with advances in policy, particularly in the United States and Great Britain, and we moved into the 80s and 90s as new healthcare challenges, in particular things like HIV, really required us to rethink how we practiced, and finding that as we practice collaboratively, patient outcomes and provider outcomes were so dramatically enhanced when we brought together all members of the team. What we know is that essentially how we are educated impacts how we practice, and that interprofessional practice is not typically threaded in the traditional healthcare professional education. And so it's important that we begin with this understanding of what is interprofessional education. So we've been talking in the course about interprofessional practice. Now let's talk about how we educate interprofessionally. Oops, sorry if that was on the mic. I hope I didn't blow your ears off. How we educate interprofessionally in such a way that we support then that developing practice approach. So let's define it, and we're going to use the CAPE definition, and that's that two or more professionals learn with, from, and about each other. And that really promotes collaboration, and we know that it enhances the quality of care. Evidence over and over has told us that. So let's talk about the benefits. Again, summary of interprofessional practice. Improved health system performance. The patient is placed at the center of care in interprofessional practice. We never practice on the patient, we practice with the patient, and it's essential to move to that shift, particularly with what we understand about what our modern patient is looking for, and again, enhancing outcomes. And because of that, we end up with that increased patient satisfaction. We have better health outcomes. We have decreased wait times when the team works collaboratively together. So there's a shorter wait time for surgeries, shorter wait time for specialty referrals, things like that. We also have greater access in rural and remote areas to the kind of healthcare that people need. So how does interprofessional education actually work? Well, here's a model that has been developed that really forms a framework for how we can integrate interprofessional education into our curriculum and really promote that in practice environments as well. So not only interprofessional education in universities and colleges, but also in hospital settings and other kinds of clinical settings. This is developed by Demore and Owandason, and this is their framework called, referred to shortly as the IEC PCP Model, and that interprofessional education for collaborative patient-centered care. And that focuses on the main factors, determinants, and elements of the model at three different conceptual levels, and those are the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level, and we're going to talk about those a little bit later. But what you see is you have the learner on one side and you have the patient on the other side. And we understand that there's educational system factors and there are professional system factors. So within the educational system, we're looking on the left-hand side, we've got things like institutional factors, that's at the large level, the largest level, so that's the learning institution. Factors associated, so for example, with the university or college, and moving down to the micro level, there's teaching factors, factors that actually affect the classroom. So for us, there's factors that affect where our class is held and the implications of the resources associated with that. And we have other elements that are really essential to the educational system listed here. So for example, the context in which learning happens, other courses that are associated with it, who's in the classroom, things like that, how faculty are supported to develop expertise in this area and how they're able to bring that to the classroom, and whether that's a face-to-face class or an online class. We also have the administrative processes that are involved in this, and also what kind of leadership is in place, and how does that leadership place resources at the hands of interprofessional educators. And so all of that is really critical when we look at that educational system. And on the other hand, we have a huge impact in the professional system. When we look at the larger level, the highest level within the professional system, we see again organizational factors, but they're different because those are organizational factors, if you can imagine, in a hospital setting or within your regulatory body, or larger societal factors, for example, who holds liability, things like that. At a micro level, or the smallest level, we also have interactional factors. So those factors as people, different members of the collaborating teams, interact with each other. And there's a lot of different factors within this model that we can also see. So there's the governance. How is your regulatory body governed? How do different regulatory bodies communicate and collaborate with each other? How is your hospital governed, and how are the different departments aligned within that? We see how you structure clinical care within a particular organization impacts how interprofessional education in the organization may happen, and whether all of the members of the team have this sense of belonging or not. And that's really critical to understand how important you think you are. Is everyone equally important in this system or not? And whether there's a shared vision or common goals. Between the educational system and the professional system, what we see are systemic factors. And so, and those systemic factors go back and forth between the two systems. They impact each other, so they move back and forth. We also see that it's important to keep in mind that there are the competencies associated with each of the professions, so knowledge, skill, attitudes, and behavior, government policies, and when you're looking at healthcare that's managed by the federal government, federal or territorial regulations. When you're looking at traditional healthcare that's managed within the provincial system, we look at provincial or regional regulations. We also look at the people who live across this country and understanding our social and cultural values. Ultimately, we have to keep in mind that underscoring all of this is the need to have research to inform our practice and to evaluate our practice. So we need to understand how that teaching and learning happens, and what are the outcomes of teaching interprofessionally. So when Hildy and I are in a classroom, does it make sense to talk about interprofessional practice, and does it make sense in our group, for example, to bring together RNs and RPNs, or students who are in the BSCM program and the RPN to BSCM program, so that we have intra-professional education, but also is there more opportunity to bring together different kinds of learners so that we have a stronger interprofessional opportunity. And we want to benchmark that and look at the outcomes. So for us, it would be important to take into account student feedback, learner experience in the course, learner experience of the content, and try to figure out, as I think most professors do, are we getting it right? Are we getting it wrong? Are we hitting our mark? Or do you think we're wasting your time? Things that really help us to try to become better, because as we become better and we are more effective in helping to galvanize the next workforce, the people who are going to go out there and make a difference, because your practice is going to be so inherently interprofessional. And then it's important to share those findings, to disseminate those findings with colleagues. Ultimately, we look at patient and provider outcomes as well. So what are the consequences of this kind of education? What are the patient consequences? So when students are educated within an interprofessional model, the care they provide leads to certain patient outcomes. Is that different than people who are educated in a model that's very siloed or traditional, where they just practice mostly within their own category of healthcare worker? What are the professional experiences, and what's their level of satisfaction? And within the system, are we able to continue to see that systemic savings? So we talk about this idea of tribalism, and tribalism refers to the silos of practice. Sorry, did you hear my phone ringing? I really apologize for that. It refers to silos of practice, and in silos of practice, each one of us practices in our own field, but we may communicate with others, but it's more an exchange of information as opposed to a true collaboration. It is so critical that we move from this a tribalism or a focus on ourselves to reach across to others and to see ourselves as full collaborators. And so it's moving away from this traditional approach where we're all socialized around our own particular expertise and our own particular knowledge. So for example, nursing students learn a lot about nursing and about how nurses behave, but may not learn as much about how the RT is educated and how the RT behaves and what the RT sees as their role within the team. And so when we learn only about ourselves and less about others, we tend to be very protective of our own role and our own domain. And then the risk is, as we become protective, we are averse to that collaboration. But additionally, we tend to try to grab power, and that's just a human nature phenomena, that we tend to be the people within the system who hold the most power. And within that model, then, do you remember that video we saw about the chickens? We move into this red zone environment where we've got highly aggressive people who are pecking at us, and a failure of real collaboration, and rather a movement towards a more aggressive and often hiddenly an aggressive environment that is a little bit hidden from everyone. And so it's important to recognize that interprofessional education happens slowly. It takes time for people to appreciate the value of it and what it means to everyone to be involved in interprofessional education. And because this is built within our professional socialization, it takes time to break down those barriers because we have been educating ourselves for decades, and in some cases for centuries, in a way that has held our own professional knowledge at the highest level and sort of created a distance between ourselves and other professionals. And now we're trying to break down those walls. Okay, so what are the benefits of interprofessional education? Critical. It provides an opportunity and the tools for us to gain the skills necessary to engage in interprofessional practice. So we've already made the case. Interprofessional practice is better for the provider, it's better for the patient, it's better for the system. The way we can move effectively into interprofessional practice is through interprofessional education. The link between the two is it's clear. It's essential that we move from interprofessional education into interprofessional practice, and it seems quite seamless when we look at the data around students who've been educated in interprofessional education and their willingness and their success in then subsequently engaging in highly collaborative, effective teams. And so additional benefits of interprofessional education are that you have an opportunity sometimes to experience a real world situations. And so, for example, in this course, we'll be doing a simulation later in the course. We have people from a range of professions that can provide input into the educational process and the focus of a course. So for example, Hildy and I will have consulted with a number of health professionals, not only in, for example, bringing you that panel where you get to hear from them directly, but behind the scenes in making sure that there's nothing in the course they would like to see that we haven't included, or that we don't, that we're failing to fully represent all of the professions. You learn to work with each other in a way that really promotes greater collaboration amongst all human service workers. And that's really important because ultimately that level of respect that you experience and that level of respect that you then demonstrate for others is going to be the foundation of your future practice. It also evokes a patient-centered ethic in practice. Now, I know within our program that is so central, it's so strong, and I have such faith in our students. But beyond our own individual program, we know that interprofessional education really supports that philosophy where the patient is at the center of care and the patient is a collaborator in their own care, and it's really effective to bring that forward. So what are some of the barriers to interprofessional education? There's a couple of different models that I'm going to talk about. When we look at Parcell and Blind, this is in your readings in your text, they talk about 4 different things. So there are structural barriers, and those are things like those external professional requirements, like our competencies for registered nurses or RPNs, the standards of practice. Those are structural barriers. So when we are collaborating with other team members, it's essential to recognize that all of us have our own competencies and our own version of standards of practice, and they're not always the same, and we need to work across those, but we cannot deny our own external structural mechanisms that impact our practice. There are professional or disciplinary barriers, and that could be things like language and nomenclature. So sometimes physicians write in their very specific terminology that all members of the team should recognize, but it may not always be that familiar to everyone. Sometimes there's a lack of knowledge about what other professionals do, so that could be professional or disciplinary barriers. There can be attitudinal barriers, and often one of the big things we see when we're talking about attitude is that reluctance to change. So do you remember I talked a little bit about the fact that we've been educated in these silos? So many of the professionals you'll be working with were educated in that silo or that silo or tribal model, where they learned a lot about their own profession and were socialized into their own professional values, but did not learn as much about others. And so coming across to each other in a way that opens up opportunity for collaboration is really important. But that means you have to be open to change, and that can be a little bit of a barrier that we experience in practice. Sometimes there's a lack of actual support in practice settings for this to happen. And also the curriculum and pedagogy have to be appropriate. So there have to be courses that support interprofessional education. In our program, this is a course that supports interprofessional education and interprofessional practice, but not all programs have that. What's essential to recognize, and we're fortunate in having this, is that as we move into a new model of program evaluation and program approval through the College of Nurses of Ontario, one of the most key new elements that they will be evaluating is how in your program are they actually teaching you to practice interprofessionally? How are they helping you to understand what those competencies are, what the basis of interprofessional practice looks like, and how you'll be able to engage in it, and why you will want to engage in it. And so that's really important. The other model, and again, this is talked about in your textbook, is the one by Anderson and Reeves. And if you remember, we just talked about that in that framework, the IEC PCP framework, the educational framework. And those are the three levels, and I referred to them when I was talking about that framework a little bit. The micro level framework, or micro level barriers, meso level, which is middle level barriers, and macro level. And so an example of a micro level barrier could be something like professional socialization. So we're socialized differently. So at that level of the individual provider, you're socialized differently, so you have different values and different expectations and beliefs about practice, about healthcare practice. At the middle level, that's where you're going to see things like administrative processes that may not support interprofessional education, or you might see leadership, a failure of leadership to see the value in implementing interprofessional education. And at the macro level, this is where you're going to see the largest level of barrier. And so that would be at that institutional level. So at the whole college level or at the whole university level, is there support for interprofessional education, which is often more complex than just educating one single kind of student in one single classroom about their own profession, as opposed to about these larger ideas focusing on collaboration. At the macro level, it's also important to recognize that you may see something like beyond the college or the university, and you may see whether there's political support. In Ontario, the Ontario government has been very overt in supporting interprofessional practice. About a decade ago, there was a fund set up to create opportunity to develop projects to support interprofessional education and interprofessional practice. And that, while the funding lasted only a couple of years, the consequences of that fund continue to be felt in healthcare and in education today. And so the Ontario government has been actively involved in supporting interprofessional education and interprofessional practice, but not all governments have been as active. So let's talk just for a second about what interprofessional education is not. So sometimes, do you remember, it's a variety of professionals learning with and about each other, right? So learning with and about each other. And so what IPE is not would be a classroom made up of learners from a whole bunch of different programs receiving the same learning experience, but without an opportunity to really reflect on what that learning means and to have that interaction with each other. So it's not sitting side by side with a different professional. It's an opportunity to actually engage with others and with people you may not know before you came into the learning experience. And so I come back to the fact, and I know it's a sore point, and I know it's hard work, and we are so very appreciative of your willingness to hang in with us. But the reason why you are placed in groups with varied learners, and both the BSCN students, RPN to BSCN students, and non-nursing students all together, and it just really names randomly put together so that you can work with people you have not worked with before, and work across potentially those differences you have in your approaches to learning, your approaches to work, and ultimately your approach to how you're going to create that ideal environment. When we're talking about what IPE is not, again, it's an educator from a different professional background than their learners, leading a learning experience without relating that to how you deliver care. So for example, interprofessional education is not having a physician come in and teach nursing students about a component of physiology or a component of nursing care, or having a dietitian come in and teach you. Interprofessional education requires that you learn with and about each other. So finally, another example, and it's only important to give these examples because it's that contrast to what the point we're trying to make, is that if you were in a clinical setting and you were led by a clinical educator from a different profession. So for example, if you went into your clinical settings and you had an RT as your clinical instructor, without talking about shared decision making or how you collaborate in practice, that's not interprofessional practice, that's just having a clinical instructor who's not from your profession. So interprofessional practice at its core, and I know I've repeated this a couple of times, it's that idea that you are learning with and about each other in the classroom. Okay, I'm not going to play this. It's just a good example of what IPE is not. So I'm going to leave it for you. You can put this on pause, and I really do hope you use that link and watch this. It's about a 4-minute video, and it's quite cute in a way for anyone who's ever been in a hospital setting, to reflect on how things sometimes go awry. So what does it mean when we say we have to go through a cultural shift to get to interprofessional education? Well, I talked about that a little bit before. The way that health and other kinds of human service workers are educated needs to change. We have to move away from that siloed or tribal approach and educate ourselves with other professionals. It also requires a cultural shift in what we value and believe. And so profession-specific programs need to change their content to reflect interprofessional education. So they have to have courses even like this. Now our course would be even more robust, where we bring in other health professions. We typically at UOIT and the Faculty of Health Sciences have some non-nursing students in our course, and so welcome to anyone who's not a nurse, but to have even a greater representation of non-nurses would make the course even that much more robust. We also need to restructure how we deliver programs to accommodate having these different educational strategies. So if we wanted to bring in other health professionals at the university, for example, UIT and Durham College are collaborative within the nursing program, but DC has a lot of other health programs. Is there an opportunity for us to collaborate in education in a different way? That requires breaking the mold. It requires rethinking what we do. And so that restructuring is really important. We also need to look at competency-based training, not just am I hired by a program to teach something, but do I have the competencies to carry out that teaching? At the same time, as I'm teaching students, they need to learn not what is their role based on rules, but each learner in each health-related program needs to focus on a competency-based approach. And that means every time you are about to do something, your question is, do I have the competency to carry out that procedure? Is it appropriate not only to my discipline, but to my own personal set of competencies? And that's a critical shift. It's not who owns the procedure, it's who has the greatest competency within this context to carry that out. So what do we know about the developing of interprofessional programs and initiatives? It's critical that we identify key principles. We talked just on the last slide about establishment of curricula that's competency-based. Remember, I don't own it by my role, but whether I do a procedure or don't do a procedure is based on my own competency within that, and that all the health professionals need to move to competency-based education. And they're based on that CIHC framework. There are some competencies worth pointing out to you. Now, do you remember that Hildy has posted, I think in week 2, a little overview of the CIHC framework, an online lecture. And it's a really nice evolving model that we're using in Canada for interprofessional collaboration. And so these are the competencies that that model has identified: interprofessional communication, patient, client, family, and community community-centered care. Remember, in interprofessional practice, we always put the patient, whether that's an individual, family, group, or community, at the center of care. Role clarification, we talked about that in week 3 when we had our panel, how critical it is that we understand not only our role, but the role of others. Team functioning, and we talked about that, I think in week 4 it was team functioning, how essential it is to understand how a team works together and to be able to self-assess in terms of how your team is functioning, and if it's functioning well, how do we build on that? If it's not functioning well, how do we identify it and take steps and evoke strategies to make changes? Look at collaborative leadership. The leader of a team is not the person by hierarchy who gets the role, but actually the person most effective in this context, in this moment, to take on that leadership. So it's that collaborative leadership. And Hildy's lecture will also help to clarify that. And interprofessional conflict resolution. Remember we talked last week, conflict positive, that idea that conflict is not a negative idea, that conflict is essential for us to make progress, but what we need to do is be able to navigate conflict in an effective way that we come out better than when we went in. In terms of developing IPE programs, it's also important to look at what are effective delivery models. So how are we going to do that? If we're teaching in a classroom, if we're teaching online, if we're teaching in a practice setting to professionals, post-registration professionals, what are the most effective delivery methods and how do we evaluate those? We need to understand what are the trainer's educational needs. So how do we support interprofessional educators to be the best kinds of educators? And that's an evolving area for discussion. And then finally, we need to do a really good, robust evaluation of interprofessional education programs to understand learners' experiences, to understand the outcomes of them, in particular to understand how they foster or do not support graduates becoming effective interprofessional collaborators themselves. And that's the end of the lecture. I hope it was of value to you. I hope you learned something new, or your interest was piqued in such a way that you go back to the reading. It was really drawn from the chapter, so taking your time going back and reviewing the chapter will help you with any gaps that you may identify. Hildy and I are thrilled to have the opportunity to be teaching you, so if there's anything we can do to support you or to provide additional information, just let us know. Have a great reading week. We'll see you the week after.